Your consumer education brand. My name is Amy Page, and I am an early childhood systems consultant with the State Capacity Building Center. Today's webinar is part of the Hot Topics in Consumer Education website series and is designed to bring you new information and resources in order to help you enhance your consumer education websites. Today's webinar, along with next week's Ask Me Anything segment, are the final sessions in the current webinar series. The series has highlighted topics that are a mix of best practices and required elements of consumer education websites. Our goal is to give you ways in which you can enhance how your audience experiences your website. This would include families, child care providers, as well as other stakeholders. We'll put the link to the webinar series in the chat box so that you can access it. The link will take you to our resource page where you can find new resources on how to enhance your consumer education website. Also there you will find the recordings and video from all of the prior sessions, as well as the Ask Me Anything sessions. Our presenters have a lot of wonderful information to share with you today, so we may not have time to field all of your questions. So throughout the webinar, we'd like for you to use the chat feature to type in any questions on this topic. You will notice the chat there under the call-in information. The gray heading for the chat box has today's date listed. So feel free to type your questions there as we go throughout the information today. We'll take your questions and sort through them the next Thursday on December 19th from 2 to 2:30 Eastern Time. We'll answer as many questions as we can in an Ask Me Anything webinar. If you think of a question after today's webinar, not to worry, we will provide you an email address this afternoon at the close of today's session, and then it will also be available to you in a follow-up email that will go out to everyone that registered. Now I'd like to take just a quick moment to gauge who we have on the call with us today by asking you to respond to the following poll. We simply would like to have you identify what your current position or role is and how it relates to branding for your consumer education website. So we appreciate you taking a moment to do that. If you've marked
Joining the meeting
in the chat box below.
Alexis Washington.
Give everybody, we've got quite a few folks, it sounds like, joining on the call, so we'll give everybody
Joining the
just
meeting.
a moment to respond to the poll.
Joining the meeting.
Looks like a vast majority of you are with state government, but I'm glad to also see some communication staff as well as other training and technical assistance professionals on the call, and also a researcher noted in the other box. So great. We're really glad that everyone's with us this afternoon. We appreciate your response to the poll. That just kind of helps us gauge who's on the call with us. We'll go ahead and go back to the main room. Here listed, you will see the objectives for today's webinar. In order to have an effective consumer education website, of course, it's vital that you find ways to make sure that your target audience is aware of your site. So we'll talk about how branding can really support awareness of your websites. Also, there are a few important components that are critical to establishing an effective brand. We'll explore what those are. And then finally, we'll also discuss key design features that can be used to enhance your brand.
Joining the meeting. Joining the meeting.
It is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. We are very fortunate to have with us Eddie Minaya and Israel Pinto from our ICF Next team. Each of them will tell you a little bit more about themselves as we go through the presentation. Now I'd like to first turn it over to get us started.
Molly Hargis.
Great. I just want to make, this is Eddie. I want to make sure you guys still hear me okay?
Yes, Eddie, thank you.
Okay. If we can go back to the previous slide, I just, so they can put a face to my voice. There we go, thank you. I'm actually the guy bottom left. Eduardo is my legal name. Everyone calls me Eddie. Just to give you a little background about me, I'm the one of the associate creative directors here at ICF Next. ICF Next, we do a lot of marketing work that has to do with things like branding, web design, digital work, landing pages, mobile apps, marketing, social media marketing, etc. We're part of a large team that it's located. I'm actually located in Fairfax, Virginia, and then there's another part of our office is also in Brockville, and then we have a large team that's also remote. So that's a little background about me, and I'm gonna let Israel kind of give a little background about himself.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can
Can you
hear you
hear me?
fine, Israel.
Oh, okay. My name is Israel Pinto, and I'm also part of ICF Next Creative. I'm a senior art director there, and I've worked with Eddie for many years now. Worked on anything and everything from web development to branding for government clients and private sector clients, and have over 15 years of experience, and looking forward to sharing some of this branding information with you.
All right, so if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. So anytime that we can share our knowledge, you know, we definitely are excited to be here. We're excited to kind of hopefully be able to give you some information from this presentation that you can apply to your website, apply to your branding. It's also very nice to see there's people from all over. I see people from Wisconsin, Mississippi, Kentucky, Illinois, Florida. Oh, well, it's definitely warmer there than it is here, I bet. So I really appreciate everyone kind of being here today. We're definitely very excited, and we are going to talk to you. We're going to start talking about branding. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. So branding, you know, we hear this word a lot. What exactly does it mean, and how does it relate to your website? You got to keep in mind branding is you know, helps your consumer education website. It kind of brings it apart from the other. It kind of be able to personalize your organization against the other ones, and that's what you want to do. You want to have a brand, a name that recognizes with a symbol, a logo, design that gives a product a unique personality, that it serves as an opportunity to shape the audience perception about your product or about your company. A brand, it's not just a logo and a color palette. A brand goes a long way. It's a tone, it's a look and feel, or the component, photography style, is the message tone that you have in your within your website that identifies your brand, that and gives you very specific and it talks to your audience, and that's one thing that is very important, that you got to speak to your audience at all times. Always as your brand elements reflect your organization core and values, but you know, it should be developed with the audience in mind. You know, if you're talking to children, you have to most likely going to brand yourself one way. If you're trying to communicate to the parents of the children, you're going to brand yourself a different way. If you're trying to communicate with, let's say, audience on the third age, you're going to have to communicate in a different way, not just in terms of the tone, but also in the terms of the look and feel and the graphics of what you're trying to develop. So we can go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned just briefly ago that branding is not just about you know, it's not just color of logo and a palette. It's a lot of the different things. This outlines it. Logo, colors, tone, fonts, all of these different key components gives you a feeling of your brand. A logo is going to identify who you are. It's going to give you the name of your organization. The colors are going to give you a feel. It's going to give you a tone. As soon as you see something from your organization, the color palette is going to give you some sort of sense of, you know, in this case we're seeing an example from the Georgia Department of Early Care and Learning, and you see the green that gives you some calm, and then it gives you the orange. It kind of works with the green, and it gives you that sense of tranquility, something, and it goes along with the photography that's of the hero image of the kid. So there, you can see the brand kind of working itself out. But it's not just these two components. Then we're talking about the tone. The tone is, the messaging. How is the messaging? How are you speaking with your audience? How are you reflecting with your audience? So if you are communicating and it's, let's say, an article that has no graphics, how can you still make that your brand and still feel as part of everything else? So if they go from this article to your website, it needs to feel that both things are connected in the way that the tone of this article is one way. Then once you get to the website, you're actually speaking with your audience on the same way. Fonts go a long way. There is, we hear of serif, sans serif. There's script fonts. There's so many different fonts, but fonts are one thing that are very they're not as subjective as color sometimes can be, and that's because fonts can give you the feeling of something being very bold, something being very light, something being very playful, something that it's very serious, something that's that's more for children. So fonts allows you to be able to play around and be able to kind of identify and be able to put your brand out there for your audience. So kind of combining your logos, your colors, the tone, and your fonts is going to be important in order to kind of build yourself your brand. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So your logo, let's single out and let's talk about component by component. In this case, we're going to talk about the first thing, your logo. Your logo, we talked about your audience. It needs, everything that you do, you have to think of your audience. Who is the one that is going to be digesting your content? It needs to resonate with your audience. It should be in style with it needs to engage your visitors when they see your logo. And it needs to also have a positive image. And the logos are going to be part of not just typography, which is just the text, but it's also going to be some sort of graphic and color. So everything has to work together in order to give you that positive feel, the elements, the colors, the positioning, the graphics themselves. So it's important that you can kind of make them all work together. A lot of times we're also kind of drawn to say, you see something trendy, and we want to kind of follow that trend because it's something that maybe it looks very, very cool, very nice, very, very trendy. But just like fashion, trendy things only last for a short period of time, and then they will go away, and then something else will come along. Sometimes the trends do come back, just like fashion, but you want to build something, you want to design something, you want to create something that is part of your brand, that is going to be long lasting, that is not just going to last for the next 6 to 12 months. You want something that you can kind of keep yourself kind of long live for years to come. So the thing you have to keep in mind as you're defining your logos, or you kind of creating your logos, is you want to keep it simple. Simple shapes, simple typography in order to be able to convey this message. A lot of times you also you can and sometimes you need to incorporate your tagline, and it's okay to do so. You just have to be cautious how and where you put it. A lot of times when we're doing any sort of branding work, we create if a tagline is required, we will create a version that doesn't have a tagline and a version that has the tagline. So we will typeset it to be that way. You also have to keep in mind that sometimes your logo, while it might be in your website on your header image, you may end up using it for something else where it has to get smaller. So if you have a lot of text,
Joining the meeting.
a lot of text, a lot of typography, as you are making the logo maybe smaller in order to fit in the smaller spaces, the content inside may be started to it will be harder to read. So kind of keep those things in mind as you're designing it. In here we have two examples. We have an example from the Idaho Stars. As you can see, there is it's resonating with the audience of who they're trying to communicate, and you have a positive image. You have the stars, you have the tree, it can reflect growth. the stars that can reflect something that's positive. And then you have the name Idaho Stars on the right. And actually, if you go out to their website, the tagline is right underneath. This version that we're showing you doesn't. But you know, they work together with the colors, the blues, the purples, and with the graphics themselves. And to the right of that, we have an example from Brighter Futures, Indiana. And here, I know the background, it's part of, I think, the website, but the logo itself, we have a sun shape that's kind of placed in between the first word, Brighter, and Future. So it kind of works together almost like a content block, giving you some sort of flow on your eye as you're kind of going from left to right. And they're using color, like the sun is yellow. It works together once you see it all into as a one component. So if we can go to the next slide. So here we have a few more examples. And this we're going to talk a little more about colors. Color sometimes can be subjective. Yes, sometimes cool colors, warm colors, they can make me feel one way and they can make you feel a different way. So sometimes they have to be, they are a little subjective, but a lot of times there are colors also that are very, they're in a general range that makes everyone kind of evokes a message that is very similar to everyone. In this example, for example, we have a sun shape where we're kind of using two different shades of orange. This is for Colorado Shines, and this, as at first as I see it, it makes me feel as something very positive, like I just reached a goal, like I'm on top of the world. And as you can see, there's a silhouette of a person that is almost like on top of a mountain with the sun behind it. Even though there's not an actual sun, the fact that it's a circle image with the colors, it starts giving you that feeling of what it is. And then you have the typography, the text on the right that kind of defines what it is, Colorado Shines. But then right below you have a tagline. I'm not sure if it's a tagline or if it was part of their kind of the requirement, but it's start early, start strong, quality early learning. And that kind of defines even more confined how, what this is, what Colorado Shines is. So just as you're creating all these graphics, just keep all these things in mind. The colors could be subjective, but sometimes you can pick colors that actually are they're for the most part, it's going to feel the same way for everyone. If, for example, in this logo, we were to change the darker orange to, let's say, red, it will give us a completely different feel. It will give us, because a lot of times we resonate red to something that means stop, because of traffic lights. If we were to change the orange on the back to be more of a darker orange or a very dark orange, then the thought of being almost like the horizon, the sun, it will probably start getting lost. If we were to change to something that's, let's say, the blue, like the shade, like the Colorado blue that's on the right, then it will probably give a different message. You kind of keep that in mind. But you also want to make sure that you don't use 10 different colors or throughout your logo. You want to keep it limited to a palette that you not only can use in your logo, but that you can use throughout your website. Also, a lot of times, keep in mind, as you're using color, that is most likely that you're going to need your logo to be reversed and also to be in black and white. To kind of keep all these things in mind as a logo is being developed. And you can always just go online, to kind of find any sort of resource. There's tons and tons of resources about color selections where you can kind of maybe start with a color palette that can be your initial kind of start off point, and then from there you adjust it. Sometimes a trick we do when we're trying to create a color palette or brand is we start with a photograph that represents kind of the tone of what we're trying to communicate. In the photographs, let's say if we were to tie this to a photograph, if we were to pick a photograph that was more of a, let's say, a sunrise, and a sunrise had some mountains behind it, and some rocks. Then we'll start picking colors from the photograph itself. They kind of work together. The photograph we know itself already works because we see it as a one completed a piece of artwork. Sorry, I just lost the slide. It's coming back. It looks like it's loading again. So as this is loading, I can continue on. So then we pick the color from a photograph, and then it allows us to kind of gives us our initial color palette. So that could be a trick that can be done, or as I mentioned, there's a lot of online resources that can give you an initial palette that you can start from. All right, if we can go out to the next slide. Tone. Tone reflects your brand's personality and connects with your core audience. Words choices are a key, to in order to always keep your audience in mind. I mean, we're going to mention this a few times, and that's because your audience is who you're speaking to, who's it for, who's digesting your content. You always got to keep them in mind. A lot of times, consider if you have to do some research, consider spending the funds and the money to do that, or to find a professional copywriter to find the right words that is the right tone for your audience, for what you're trying, how you're trying to put your personality of your brand for your audience, and make sure that you always align it with other resources from your organization. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have like an article and your article is just text, it has to when you read it, the tone of the message has to be the same as if you're reading it on your website. If all your messages are in the third person, then every message throughout, that is your tone. That's how you speak with your audience. That's what your audience is going to get used to hear, to read from you. So you want to make sure you keep that consistent. The tone is always going to be very, very important. I mean, you can say the same word in a few times, but if you use uppercase, lowercase, sentence case, spacing, all these things change sometimes. Even though there's the same words, it can also change the tone. So keep all these things in mind. So just to give you an example, let's say you have a pet, and I say a dog, and you tell your dog no. If you say no, that means for them, it's already saying, okay, this is a tone. But if you say no, don't do that, that's a different tone. But even though I may be saying and conveying the same message, so you want to keep your tone consistent throughout. So choosing the right words, the right keywords are going to be important in order to kind of keep your audience engaged. If we go to the next slide, please. Fonts. We talked a little bit about fonts, and we see there's a whole science with typography, which are fonts, in terms of what you can do. I mean, there's a whole world out there with typography, with fonts. If you're not as familiar with design, you may be familiar with fonts like Arial, Times New Roman, things that you probably have seen on your like in Microsoft Word and Outlook, etc. But there is a whole world of fonts out there. They can communicate so much in terms of how they look. As I mentioned earlier, there's fonts that are heavy, that are light, that are playful, that are handwritten. All these are going to give you a tone and a feel with everything else. So you want that to be consistent, and you want everything to kind of tie together. As you're selecting your fonts, you got to keep in mind that you don't want to also use 3 or 4 different fonts, because it just gets confusing. You want to keep it to one, maybe 2 fonts. Maybe your headlines are a sans serif font, and then your body copy is a serif font. Serif fonts are easier to read, and even though this is the way there was newspapers back, the way newspaper for years and years and centuries, I think it was always a serif font that was used for body copy. Sans serifs are actually easier to read, so that's because it's definitely a lot more popular, especially for devices like if you're reading content, digesting content through your computer, through your laptop, through your mobile phone, through your tablet. those will be easier to read within the body copy. But because if you want to use a secondary font, like a serif font, will give you a nice headline, something that looks maybe fancier, and that's the tone that you're going for. Just keep your font simple, and always try to keep it a classic look. And I mentioned serifs and sans serif, and pretty much those are fonts that have the thin strokes and the thick strokes. Those are your serif fonts, and your sans serif are the ones that are not. So sometimes it's good to combine. If you're choosing two fonts, one that is a serif and one is a sans serif, they always complement each other if you use those two. Okay, we can go to slide number 12. So here we have an example, and this is just a screen grab from one of our ICF Next websites, where we're showing, and I was showing this because it has a lot of typography, has some graphics around it, but as you can see, we're actually using the same font all the way from the headlines, the subheads, the call to actions, the body copy. The ICF Next wording, that's actually the logo itself, so that counts more as a graphic. But the typography used throughout, including the 2X on the right, all that typography, all the font is actually the same. However, as you see it looks different, and that's because it's treated different. We have font that is bigger, so it kind of is outlining what's your headline. You have the font below the Getting Passenger Loyalty on Track, right below that smaller text that is all caps, and that serves as a subhead, and it has some spacing in between, so that gives it a style, already a look, a tone. Then the call to action, let's talk, that's inside the button, that also is giving you now a tone and how the call to actions are going to be applied. And then you have like the approach and the payoff, which are very similar to the subheads because that's the style that's kind of going for. And then the same font is used in the body copy. It might be different weights. One may be light, one may be regular, one may be semi-bold, one may be bold, and one might be extra bold. So as you're selecting your fonts, keep that in mind. If you really like a font, and that's really the font that is kind of driving your style, just kind of keep that in mind. It's possible you may just be able to stick with one. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So design tips to enhance your brand and work within your constraints. As you're designing, you're looking at your website, the layout is going to be important. It's going to be it's going to be the key of how you organize your components. Always think of it as users, people, all your audience are going to be digesting your content in multiple devices, right? So sometimes knowing a little background of how they're going to come to your site, if mobile is 90% used and 10% only on desktop, then you can kind of design maybe and apply your layout based on this. But applying your layout is going to be important, and having a hierarchy, a layout that works, a layout that gives your message out based on who your audience is. If your audiences are going to be 90% in mobile phones, and you want to put something that's the most important thing up into the top area because it's going to be digested and most likely viewed most of the times through a mobile device. And you want to give some sort of hierarchy in terms of, you want to make sure that as the user is going through the content, that they know what's more important, what's second most important, and what's kind of tertiary kind of layer. And you want to be able, you don't want to have everything to kind of be the same size or be the same weight or the same color. You want to be able to, with color, with layout, be able to arrange your hierarchy so it makes sense for the message that you're trying to convey. We also probably heard this a lot of white space. White space is so important. We call white space negative space. You might have heard that term as well. Pretty much, for us, it's almost as a tool. And we've been doing this for a long time. And white space sometimes for for the audience that may not get exactly 100% how to do it, they don't think it's as important, but it is important. When you see a piece that has very well balanced negative white space, and you see it as like, and it looks very simple and very simplistic, and you know, the first thing that comes to mind is like, well, it looks really simple. Maybe that wasn't so hard to do. It's actually the opposite. Having white space and balance it out in a way that it makes it, you're using white space as a tool, is actually the opposite. It's actually very difficult to do. But you know, with once you apply it, and once you have that in mind, that you need that white space in order to, as you're kind of going through content, it allows you to be able to use it as visual breaks that allows you to be able to, the user to be able to, okay, this is where I stop, and now this is my visual break. Okay, on to the next content block to digest the content. So use it. It's actually important. Don't be scared of using white space. You know, and images are always going to be important. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to make sure that you have a style also for your photography. You know, you have, you know, if the style you're going for is, let's say, you know, people kind of working, and you have people crossing their arms and, you know, kind of in a group looking at the camera, that's a very classic stock photography you will find, and those are easy to find. But if you're looking for more action photos where they're actually doing the work, and maybe they're not looking at the camera, and then it has a depth of field where the background is maybe blurry and the foreground is pretty much sharp, then that gives you already a style. It's already giving you a style of how you want to treat it. Maybe it's a style where you are, you know, you want to bring up the colors on the photograph because that's what's going to kind of fit in with your brand, with what you're trying to communicate. Then make sure that you keep it consistent throughout. And iconography, it's important too. It's allows you sometimes to communicate messages without saying a lot of words. As users, we're always rushing. We're always kind of digesting our content in a very quick way. So every time, if you're on a desktop or a mobile device or a tablet, we're always going to be kind of going in a fast way. So having visuals like icons that represent something, and sometimes you do have to put some context next to the icon in order to provide what description of what the icon is. But the fact that there's an icon and there's a short, or you know, description or a title or right next to it, it allows you to quickly know, okay, this section is about this. So having icons and try to minimize text will be important. And last but not least, be consistent. You know, be consistent in how you're doing it. Be consistent in throughout your pieces. So if you're doing this in one of your website pages, make sure that you keep that consistency throughout, because that's going to be key as a you know, user. If we go from one page and we go to another website page and it looks, maybe the header is different, the footer is different, we feel that we got lost and then we clicked on the wrong place and then we're somewhere else, and we may close it and just move on. So you want to avoid that. You want to make sure that it's consistent. Okay, so next I'm going to pass it on to Israel. Israel is going to talk to you about applying the brand.
Thanks, Eddie. And so we're going to be building, actually, on the last slide that I just went through some of those tips, go into a little more detail now as to how to, you know, some tips and just some more information on each one of those. And we're going to start with the idea of consistency. If we go to the next slide, please. So consistency is really important. It's the key to building that distinctive and recognizable look that you want for your brand or your website. And so that's what we talk about. You know, the consistency builds and reinforces a strong branding personality. And we use that word personality intentionally because much like when you get to know someone, right, and you get to know their personality traits and you associate those traits with that person, traits like your fonts, your colors, you know, your layouts, the amount of white space you use, the type of photos you pick, those are the traits of your site. So that's what adds up to your branding personality. And having that be consistent is really is what builds and memorable, something that when people look at it, they recognize it. Oh yeah, this is so-and-so site, or this is that brand right there. You know, I mean, just think about the last time you walked into a Starbucks. That green on white, right, is forever now probably burned into our psyche as belonging to Starbucks. So, and there's a reason for that, because they consistently apply that brand in everything that they do. So that's very important, and it's key to building that recognition. However, to balance that out, you do have to think about flexibility, right? Because consistency can also lead to sort of repetitive designs that get sort of feel dull, boring. You know, it looks like the same old thing all the time. So going back to personality traits, right? It's kind of like, you know, somebody who loves to tell jokes, right? And tells you a new joke every week, or a person that tells you the same jokes, same 2 or 3 jokes every time, right? You don't want to be that second person. You know, you want to have something fresh every time that you meet people, but that also is consistent with all the elements of your personality. So if we go to the next slide. A couple of considerations. I know that everything I just mentioned is kind of like a high-level sort of conceptual sort of idea, but there's, you know, wanted to give you a couple of things to think about that were a little more practical. So the first thing is not restricting your logo placement to a specific location in the layout. I want to talk about this real quick because, so this is talking about when you have different pieces across different media, right? Let's say you have, on your website, you have your logo in the top left-hand side. But then you're also, you know, to promote the website, you're going to send out a postcard to a bunch of people. So for the postcard layout, it might make more sense for the logo to be in the top right. And that should be okay. That's not inconsistency per se. That's just adjusting to the different medium and different layouts requirements. So there's nothing wrong with that. However, I just wanted to note that, so for something like a website, as Eddie, I believe, mentioned earlier, having your logo in a consistent spot throughout the whole website is important, because it gives people an anchor and a consistent placement where they can find, you know, where they can answer that question, what side am I on? They'll always know that your logo is in one spot throughout the site. So, but when it comes to applying that throughout different pieces, you can have some flexibility there. As far as length of content, so different platforms have different requirements. You know, let's think about how busy we are nowadays, right? Most of us don't feel like we have a lot of time to even, you know, maybe read a full article like what we used to do with newspapers, right? Read a complete sort of a long-form piece of text. So think about when you're interacting over social or web, you know, those should be more shorter and succinct. Social should always be the shortest. Web can be a little bit longer. And print is usually the medium where you can best accommodate really long or detailed content, but definitely keep your audience and your medium in mind when you're trying to figure out how much content to give them and when. And then things like colors and saturation. We talked earlier about having a color palette that's defined and consistent throughout your brand and your site. However, there's going to be times, so for example, social media, right, where there's so much saturation, right? There's so many visuals that we all see every day that it might make sense to take one of your colors, which was possibly muted, more of a muted color for good reasons because it's applied to print a lot. When you transfer that to social media, it's okay to maybe bump up the saturation so it feels a little bit more exciting, a little bit more eye-catching. You're not really breaking the consistency of the brand because it's still in general the same color, but you are adjusting to a new media and making the most of it for that. So you can have some flexibility there as well. Next slide, please. The next thing I want to talk about is the pattern library. So these are extremely helpful in developing new content for a site, whether it's a new section or an entire new page. So a pattern library is basically a set of building blocks that you can pull together quickly to create content. And it has the built-in benefit of consistency, right? Because these are all been prepared and designed to meet all of your branding requirements. Not to mention that it can greatly speed up design or reduce design time, however you want to look at it. So it's really sort of a group of style guide and user interface elements you can just, drop in as needed to create content more quickly. Next slide, please. So for the next few slides, let's talk about a few concepts to keep in mind when designing the layout of your pages. So the first one, which Eddie mentioned as one of the tips, is visual hierarchy. Now this refers to the order in which you see content, a viewer sees content. Anytime you engage with a new piece of content, your eye automatically goes to the thing that grabs its attention, right, first. And then it moves through the rest of the content. And so it follows this path through a page or a postcard or a flyer, whatever that may be. And so where design comes in is that you can actually influence and sometimes determine how that flow goes. And you want to make sure that you put the most important content up front and that grabs the most attention and that it's seen first, and then everything else comes second and then third, right? There's a nice order that makes sense, that creates, that helps people to move through the content in an easy and engaging way. So, and we talked about the logo placement again before. So it's good to have it in a consistent place because it gives people an anchor, sort of like, a reference point for the rest of the content. Another thing to keep in mind, which Eddie mentioned as well, is text sizing and formatting, to using that to indicate content structure. And if you've ever used Word, you're familiar with that concept. Heading 1 is bigger than heading 2, which is bigger than heading 3. And it seems like a very simple thing, but you would be surprised how many times we run across designs where that simple concept hasn't been really applied to pages. And so you'll have, something that's supposed to be a subhead grab your attention before the actual main heading does. And so that can confuse your audience, and you don't want to do that. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to engage with your content. And by having this hierarchy, right, in something as simple as your text sizes, it gives them a roadmap through the content before they even read anything. They know what the page is about, how many subsections it is, and so they already have an idea in their mind what they're about to read. And then the last thing to keep in mind for this as well, for creating visual hierarchy, is using color to your advantage. So bright colors usually draw more attention. Think of, warning or danger signs. They're typically bright yellows and reds, right? And that's for a reason. Think about lightness. So where brightness is about the intensity of a color, lightness, you can think of it more as how close it is to either white or black. So a light color, say like a, sky blue, it won't pull your eye. It's very calming. It won't distract you or grab your attention. However, a dark color, more like a navy blue, is a lot heavier and denser. So a large block of that will pull your visual interest, your eye. And so that may be a way that you grab a viewer's attention and highlight a piece of important information for them to read. And so if we can look at this example here, the first thing that I see, no, if you can go to the next slide. The first thing that I see when I look at this layout is the headline, Positive Impact, celebrating 50 years of positive impact. And, that gives me a sense of what I'm about to read before I even look at anything else. And, that's exactly what you want the reader to do. You want them to read what the page is about and then move down the page to the other supporting content. Interestingly enough, here, the type is large enough that it grabs your attention, even though the graphics behind it don't have a ton of bright or saturated color. So this is where, a designer can really be helpful, because they can take all the things that we're talking about and help you create something, because sometimes you can do some counterintuitive things that still support, in general, the goals of your brand and the goals of visual hierarchy and all the other concepts we're talking about. So if we can go to the next slide. Here's another example, and talking about hierarchy, we've seen this one before. Eddie talked about some of the color and the layout. But again, the first thing that I look at when I first presented with this page is the image of the superhero, right? Which is a wonderful image. It sets the tone. And then I read the headline, right? Finding quality childcare doesn't have to be a mystery. So it's already telling me what the point of the website is it's already giving me a very positive feeling before I engage with any of, the navigation or anything else here. I'm already feeling positive and sort of like empowered. And if I am looking for quality childcare, I know that I've come to the right place. And so from there, from the headline, then my eye moves down to the peach color or orange color bar, and then onto the heading, which matches the same color, which is the next largest font on the page. So it has a very nice flow. Another thing to note is that the navigation, even though it's set in a color that's fairly saturated, that green, because the photograph draws my attention first and the headline is large enough, I don't spend a lot of time just dwelling on that navigation. And that's the way it should be, because that navigation is more practical. It should be there and easy for me to find when I need it, but it shouldn't get in the way of me engaging with the actual content in the page that I came to look at. So we can go to the next slide. So another element that relates to layout, which Eddie also mentioned, is white space. And so, as he mentioned, it just refers to areas in the layout that do not contain images or text. So it doesn't actually have to be white, but it does have a dramatic effect on the initial impression that someone gets of your site. So this is where it becomes a little bit more a subjective aspect of design, but there are some general rules that you can follow, or some guidelines, rather. So little white space usually results in a crowded layout that feels very, very packed and busy and crowded. And that sort of crowded feel makes it uninviting, or it kind of makes you think twice about engaging with it, right? Think about the difference between opening up a fiction novel, right, in a small paperback, right, that's only like a couple hundred pages, to picking up a big hardback tome that's over 1,000 pages, right? Before you even read a word, you already made an assumption about those two different things. Which one is going to be easier for me to get through, right? And so in the same way, a crowded layout makes you feel like there's so much here. Where do I start? Where when you have a generous amount of white space, it allows, as Eddie mentioned, visual breaks as somebody's scanning through the content. If you have that visual hierarchy built in, people can find the most important information quickly and know that they're in the right place to get the information they wanted. And so it just gets them to get past that hurdle of that decision of, is this the right place for me to be, and do I want to engage with this content? Because we make decisions from a visual perspective before we even read a word. So we take in visuals and visual impressions before we read a single piece of text. And so it's important to create that inviting environment and that sense of openness that white space can help you achieve. Next slide, please. So again, looking back at this example, and we keep using this example because it really is it's a good example of a lot of the things that we're talking about. And we also figure, it's by looking at the same thing, it's easier to kind of pinpoint where all of these things are working together. And so again, one person can look at this and say, well, there's so much empty space. Like, can't we put, look at that photo. It's, make it smaller and just put other things around it. Can we highlight this other thing, put a button here, a call out, anything else? But there's something about the simplicity of this that makes me want to engage with it. And also think about your audience. In every decision that you make, think about your audience. What do they need to know? And give that the most space. And that's what they've done here. That headline, again, tells you exactly what you're going to find here. And if that's what you're looking for, as soon as you see that, you know you've come to the right place. So next slide, please. So when it comes to layout, now we've covered a bunch of things. So there are some resources online that can help you kind of make some of these things a little easier to implement and to try out. So obviously, there's Microsoft Office, whether it's on your desktop or online. But there's other things such as Canva, which makes you're able to design anything from a flyer to a social media graphic or post using that. And it has some very, mostly for the most part, very intuitive tools that are very easy to use. There's something like, other resources like Piktochart, which can help you create some infographics. And there's stock layouts, which can also help you with website design and again, help you build that pattern library that can help you build a consistent look for your site. Next slide, please. So we've talked about layout quite a bit. Now let's talk about imagery, which is another very important aspect of this. So visuals, whether it's photos, icons, or illustrations, as Eddie mentioned, should have a consistent look that matches your brand. So that is the most important thing, because that will really, for lack of a better term, that will give you the biggest bang for your buck. Because a lot of times what you'll see is there won't be a consistent look. Some images will look like, not stock photos. They have a very real human feel, like you just took a snapshot of a moment in time. While others, everybody's looking at the camera and everybody has perfect hair, and you totally can tell that that's a stock photo. And when you put those two things in the same site, right, the user's getting two very different visual feelings from those images that aren't consistent. So it's not helping you build that strong and recognizable brand. So making those kinds of choices is very important. And once you have established that look, an image library can really help sort of not only reduce the amount of time that it takes to find a photo for a new project, but also it helps you ensure that anybody who creates content, right, will pick from a set of photos that all meet the same branding requirements. So, and there's also many online resources for images, and some have some very good free images, and others have some very good low-cost options as well. So next slide, please. So icons, those are a favorite among people who work in communications and who design pieces. But I think there's some things that sometimes we can forget, because we're trying to sort of include visuals, and icons are such a easy and interesting and a lot of times engaging way to add a visual element to break up a lot of text. But in picking icons, we need to keep a few things in mind. They should be simple and universally understood. Think about the icons you see at the Olympics, right? You don't need text, you don't need an explanation. You see the visual and you understand what it conveys. The best icons, that's what they do. So if the icons you're picking do that and you don't have to explain it to anybody, then those are perfect icons for what you're using them for. They should be used selectively. So a lot of times, if you have, let's say you have 10 sections in a site or a printed piece, one of the suggestions might be, well, let's have an icon for each one of the 10. And then each one has 5 subsections. So let's have an icon for each one of the 5. So now you're talking about 50 icons. And again, unless they're all very simple and universally understood, now you're asking your user to keep track of 50 different visuals that are supposed to help them understand something, where it might actually be, doing the opposite. It's just making things a little bit more confusing for them. And the last thing is, if you're trying to illustrate a complex idea or a process, a lot of times it's better to use illustrations than icons, because icons have a very limited use. So next slide, please. So here's a couple of examples of really good icons. And one of the things you'll notice is that the ones on the top have a very consistent look, a rounded line, thin line, no color, whereas the ones on the bottom have larger, dark areas of color. They're a little more square. But each one feels like they're part of a different family of icons. And that's where that consistency piece comes in. All of your icons should feel like they're of the same family. Next slide, please. So one other thing to talk about when it comes to imagery, always keep in mind that imagery always comes with specific copyright attached to it. It may be free, completely free, and may require no attribution or credit. However, a lot of times it does. There's also maybe some restrictions about sharing it with a third party. So if you use it for one project and then somebody else asks you, can I use that for mine? You may have the right to use it, but may not have the right to share that with somebody else. These copyright agreements can be complex, and so we definitely, when it comes to visuals, definitely take time to understand how you're allowed to use them and share them before you do. So next slide, please. And then finally, a branding guide is just, again, kind of like the pattern library. It's a place where you can collect all of the branding information into a single resource so that when somebody new comes along, or anybody who needs to create content, they can understand what your brand's about. They can know where to go to find, like a pattern library or an image library, and all the guides that they need to follow in order to create a piece that follows the branding requirements of your site or of your brand. Next slide, please. And then lastly, and I'll ask Eduardo or Eddie to jump in as well on this one. But we just want to talk briefly about social media because it's a much easier way to sort of explore your brand and try different things out with your brand because it's so quick. You can make updates really fast, and it moves at a much faster speed of development than other media. Just keep in mind, again, some of the things to think about is keep your content audience focused, keep it short, keep it engaging. Don't be afraid to, again, tweak some of the colors and such to really bring that life and capture people's attention as they're scrolling through all of the various content they're exposed to every day. And Eddie, anything to add to that?
Just I will say that to keep it consistent. So if you're consistent in terms of how often if you're using social media, keep it. If you do it once a week, keep it once a week, twice a week. Also, keep in mind with social media, there's accessibility options now with Facebook, with Twitter, with Instagram, where you can actually turn those options on. For the most part, they're going to be off. So you would have to turn them on to kind of add an alt tag or things that you would normally do on your website to make it accessible for someone that may be using a device to kind of read the content out loud. So kind of keep that in mind and make sure you utilize those tools that are already part of all the social media channels.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eddie and Izzy, for all of the information. As we close up, we would like for you to respond for a couple of evaluation polls. Your responses are not tied to your name, so you are able to answer anonymously. This first poll asks about how much your understanding of branding for consumer education websites has improved, so we'll give everybody just a moment to respond to that. Great. Thank you so much for your responses. This next poll, we'd also like to know if you think you will consider or apply any of the information or strategies shared in today's webinar in your future work. And thanks again for responding. As we close, we want to just ask or let you know and give you reminders about next week's Ask Me Anything webinar. Again, it will be next Thursday from 2 to 2:30 Eastern Time. We will follow up, so if you have any questions that are burning after today's webinar, you can email them to the email that's listed there in blue. Feel free to go ahead and still continue to submit any questions that you have into the chat box, and we will pull from those questions as well. And so there's no need to register for the Ask Me Anything event, so we hope that you'll be able to join us. And then the last poll that we have that we want to follow up with on, we would like to know from you what additional webinar topics may interest you. I mentioned early on in today's session that this webinar, as well as next week's Ask Me Anything, concludes the series for 2019, but we are working on continuing with additional consumer education webinars in 2020. And so if you just take a moment, if there are any other additional webinar topics that are of interest, we would appreciate that feedback. Thank you. And as we close out here, we are going to just share with you a couple of resources as the room pulls back up here. The first link here is for the Office of Child Care landing page for consumer education resources, and then the bottom link is the main early childhood training and technical assistance system page where you can access resources on a wide variety of CCDF-related topics. The links that you see here lead you to the webinar series that we have had that includes the recordings and slide decks for all of the webinars that we've had throughout the Consumer Education webinar series. There are also 4 resource guides listed here at the bottom that are available. There's additional resource guides available too that focus on posting aggregate data and best practices for translation. 2 new guides will be posted very soon, one on social media strategies as a follow-up from last month's webinar, and then also coming very soon will be a guide, a resource guide related to today's topic about branding your consumer education website. And so we are really excited to share those with you and hope that everybody will follow up and take advantage of accessing those resources. We just want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar today. Please remember to type any questions. You can continue to do that in the chat box, and then if you think of questions afterwards, the email address is here on the screen as well. We hope to see you on the Ask Me Anything webinar next week on December 19th. Thanks again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.